I'm Jeff.
I'm Tyler.
And this is the Kind Faith Bible podcast, and we're excited to be here. Thanks for joining us. We're going to go in an interesting direction today and talk about maybe the most famous passage for Christians, which is in Matthew 28, go make disciples of all nations.
That's right.
And then let's kick around. We're going to kick around some statistics and talk about what's been said, what's legendary, what's true statistically, and some opportunities that we can take to actually bring the greatest gift we could possibly bring, relationship with Jesus Christ, to people around us. So let's talk about this journey. We weren't planning on talking about this, but we decided to roll the camera because both of us were kibitzing about our frustration with how evangelism is spun and all of that. So you heard a statistic. 4% of people in the Bay Area are actually Christians. So 96% of people in the Bay Area have no faith and are hostile to the gospel of Jesus.
Yeah, that's been kicked around by a lot of Christian leaders in this area. We both have used that statistic in our old ministry in the past.
Cue guilty face.
Yeah, and my family and I moved up to the Bay Area 2.5 years ago now, and we heard that from a lot of different sources, so we just accepted it.
Yeah.
And kind of rolled with it, and that over the last couple years, it starts to change your perspective a little bit, right? If I go into a scenario thinking, okay, 96% of the people I interact with in my city are hostile toward my faith, it's going to change. Like I had those feelings every once in a while. Like every time someone might find out, like, oh, you work in ministry or you work at a church, like I would brace myself for, okay, what's going to happen now? And again, my wife Melanie and I were consistently surprised, honestly, about how welcoming people were. They actually were kind of excited to hear, like, oh, you pastor at a church nearby, and you're Christians, but you're living that way, and we've had incredible conversations with people all over the map in terms of their own spirituality, and then. The kind of impetus for this conversation a year ago, I was in seminary, graduating with my master's, and I wrote a paper about the state of the church in the Bay Area. And the good thing about seminary is whenever you cite a statistic, you have to actually have some like credentials there. You gotta cite it. And so I said, okay, well, I've been using this statistic, 4%, so I have to go do some digging and figure out what was the research that created that statistic. And I couldn't find it. It's nowhere. I actually tracked down some of the well-known voices that say that online and on podcasts that I've listened to, and I emailed and tried to actually find like, so what was the source? And they got back like, oh, it's just in the air. Right? It was this kind of thing.
And that happens a lot. I mean, we circulate a lot of things in the air. And it intuitively makes sense because it's what we watch and witness, but it's not completely true. And I think the heart of the issue is, what does that statistic mean? And it could mean two things. Yeah. It can mean that there's people who are hostile to my faith, that I'm not going to be well received, that if I say I'm a pastor, then people aren't going to know how to deal with me and want to get away from me as fast as they can. Or it can mean there's this hunger in the culture to engage. And so what I thought we would do, Tyler, is just how do you shift from all these people are against me to I've got great work and I've got some good tools to have, knowing that a good number of people. By the way, the statistic from Pew Research is that 16%, and that's this year, on their website, Pew Research, 16% of people in the Bay Area consider themselves affiliated with a Protestant style church. So non-denominational Baptist. That doesn't include Catholic. If you include Catholic, the number goes up considerably. I can't remember it.
Yeah.
I only have the 16% here. But
I could throw just I
Yeah.
pulled up so some of the data that I think has been misused. This is actually from a Christianity Today article titled "Evangelicals Behaving Badly with Statistics." And there was this. It's written by Christian Smith, and he found this scary statistic. And maybe this is where the 4%. This is the one place I could find. That 4% of today's teens will grow up to be evangelicals. But upon further research, Smith discovered that source was an informal survey of about 200 so youth pastors over a few
all
months.
sitting around at a conference talking and
Another one that's thrown around a lot on the flip side, in my old ministry university, we used this one a lot, was that 80% of today's youth are going to completely leave the church, never to return. There was this mass exodus. And if you ask one person, it's 75, one person, it's 90, but somewhere, take the average, it's about 80% are going to leave, never to return. And
I've quoted that statistic probably more
too.
times than I should count.
And there's a sense like latching on to that kind of fear-based statistic. In a way, if your personality is such, it kind of galvanizes you. As a staff, I believe that statistic. I had no reason not to. And it kind of, I was working on college campuses, and so I felt like that's the battle cry, right? I'm going to make sure that my campus does not see that mass exodus of students away from the faith and all of that. But you actually, this is in another book. Rick Richardson wrote this book, You Found Me, which is a much more positive spin on what is the state of spirituality out there. And actually, there's so much more hopefulness in the world at large of how much people want to talk to you. But he says that this actually came from a gathering of, again, some high school youth group leaders who just guessed their averages. And so it was just a very informal, no actual research was done, but this number kind of started to grow, and it continues to be used. So that just kind of pokes some holes at when you see something that maybe is that extreme, we should put the brakes on and say, okay, so what is the state?
And I put the brakes on even deeper. I don't know, harder. I'm not sure how to press that analogy, but I think any time we're motivated by fear, we've lost the gospel. Anytime I'm afraid of people not going to church anymore, one of the things that I hear all the time is, "Oh my gosh, we're going the way of Europe." Yeah. You know, that's fear-based. And evangelism out of fear, I'm just going to say it straight up, it doesn't work. I was sitting with a friend on Friday night, and we were talking to a coworker. And she has a coworker who's Indian, and she did the brilliant, best possible tool for evangelism that she could have used. And I don't think she intended to do it, but she just sat down with them and said, "Tell me what it's like to be a Sikh. I'm just curious. I want to know."
Yeah.
And she practiced curiosity without judgment, and in so doing, opened the door for him to ask in return, "Tell me about your faith." And at that point, it was just information sharing about their faith. Yeah. But we know we've got the gospel, and it's true. And when people hear the truth of the gospel, it's going to resonate in a way that his religion has not resonated with him. And it was this powerful tool of just being curious.
Yeah. So I could say it maybe just as controversial, but I have come more and more to dislike apologetics. Apologetics, that's the kind of field within Christianity of defending your faith. Mm-hmm. And there's some aspects of it that I still love. I went heavy into that whole field all through college, and there's a sense of I need to be able to defend that the Bible is reliable, that these events happened, that my faith actually has solid ground, like all of that. And there are still times where I dust off my old apologetic arguments, absolutely. But what I found over the years is going into a conversation with an unbeliever with my apologetics hat on, as if this is a debate that I need to win, has never actually worked out for me. Like I have won plenty of arguments and completely burned all the bridges with that relationship. So what was ultimately, who won there?
Yeah.
Right? Like who cares if I could win an argument and leave someone feeling battered and they never want to actually talk to me again?
And haven't you found that it's mostly Christians who are fascinated with apologetics?
Yeah.
Like it's mostly Christians, and that's not to criticize, because we dive into this faith, and I was talking with a friend this morning at coffee, and we were talking about how ridiculous Christianity is. It's just ridiculous, and it's not a safe religion. It's not a comfortable religion. It's really hard. And so once you've walked into that as a Christian, it becomes, hey, I want to be able to be confident that this stuff that's so radical that I'm reading in the Bible is from God. Yeah. So it's not a criticism, but it is to say that I think, and that's the whole point of the kind faith, that if we proceed with kindness toward people, it is the best possible evangelism. They'll know you're Christians by your love, right? And we have that marching song about that. And we have struggled consistently with how to love people. And the closest we get is work and action. But actually engaging in conversations about Jesus is it's rare.
Yeah.
It's rare. One of the questions Ryan Pfeiffer, mutual friend of ours, friend of the podcast. Yeah. we could quote Ryan. He won't mind. I was leaving the church I was at. We were at lunch. He and a few of the university staff. I don't know. Were you there for that?
I don't.
You may have been. We were at Sammy's Pizza, and I was leaving, and Pfeiffer was with me and a few other university folks. But the waiter came over and was kind of attracted to this conversation and the joy around the table. And Ryan looked at him and said, "Hey, tell me your spiritual background." In one question, the waiter, who knew he was going to get in trouble, sat down and started to share his story about where he had gone spiritually. It had very little to do with Jesus, but all of a sudden the door was open. Curiosity is so powerful.
Yeah. The kind of template mantra that I still use, that we would use with Ryan, with InterVarsity, when we're talking about how we do evangelism, we think of three stories: your story, their story, God's story. And it's a relationship. I genuinely want to get to know somebody, and not come in with a nice polished argument where I can cut down all of their logic and prove to them that my faith is the best. Actually, it starts with, hey, what's your background? Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. Right? And then in the midst of that, if it's an actual relationship being formed, I'm going to naturally have a chance to share some of my own story that points me to God's story. And so those three stories is basically the conversation that I've had that have always gone the best, is when I'm genuinely trying to get to know someone, and when it's appropriate, not trying to just derail every conversation, but when it's appropriate to say, what's your spiritual background? And it's usually more appropriate than we realize, right? And when you actually ask that question, you would be just incredibly surprised at how often people want to engage.
They want to engage if they know that they're not going to be judged.
Yeah.
And this is the part that I've found in my faith. I've had to set aside, and it's hard to say set aside, and maybe put in the margins or set in the background is a better way to say it. But I've had to set aside the truths that I need them to ascribe to. Mm-hmm. I in college lived in a house, and half of us were from Young Life and the other half were Campus Crusade. And the great joke was we would watch sports together, and any time the number 4 made it into the score, one of the Young Life guys, usually me because I was a punk, would say, "Hey, it's 14-6, and speaking of 4, have you heard of the 4 spiritual laws?" I would tease them. Although I use the 4 spiritual laws in my ministry, but I would lead with the facts and the tenets, so to speak, of God's story before ever discovering the person's story.
Yeah.
And before ever giving touch to points to my story. And the longer I've lived, the more I realize if I'm honestly, non-judgmentally engaging their story, and I'm honestly, with vulnerability, sharing my story, God's story comes out.
Yeah.
I don't have to have the points memorized. I don't have to know the names of all the characters in the Bible.
Yeah. Two of my favorite Bible passages to talk about this topic. One is from John chapter 4, and the other is from Mark chapter 2. In Mark 2, there's this...
Wait, you like Mark? The book of Mark?
Yeah, it's incredible, right?
Kind of shocking.
Yeah. Have I quoted Mark every episode so far?
Yeah.
Probably. So, in Mark chapter 2, Jesus meets this tax collector named Levi, and he would have been hated. He was a Jew working for the Roman oppressors, and the Jews hated him. He had a gray area relationship with the Romans. Like he was an outcast, but also making a lot of money on the backs of his Jewish countrymen. So he was hated. Jesus finds him, says, "Follow me." Levi leaves his tax booth, and then all the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, start snubbing their noses at Jesus, like, "Oh, this guy, he hangs out with all
tax
the
collectors
people."
and sinners.
Yeah,
come on.
But that story then it says Levi hosts a party, and Levi has a bunch of tax collector friends, and so he gathers them around Jesus, and Jesus goes and hangs out and eats and has this party with Levi and all of his friends, and again the religious leaders judge Jesus and say, "Oh, who is this that eats with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus kind of turns back and says, "But that's why I came. These are the people that are on the outside that have totally gotten life wrong, and look, I'm coming to them. So of course." And so, but that idea that it was Levi who could reach his friends better than anybody else. And in a similar way, so John 4 is a famous story of the woman at the well. And this woman from Samaria who has had 5 husbands and now is living with a guy who's not even her husband, comes to the well at noon all alone, and Jesus has this interaction with her. It's such a fascinating story. In the midst of this, the disciples go into the town to buy some food, and he keeps talking with the woman. And then throughout that time, he's offering her this living water, and she receives this overflowing living water, which is Jesus's life and message itself. And she's like overflowing, and goes back into the same town. And there's this moment where the disciples come back. You can almost picture them like crossing each other in the road. The disciples come back with a bunch of sandwiches. She goes back into the same exact town and starts telling everyone, "I met this man. He told everything about me, and could he be the one we've been waiting for?" And the whole town comes back ready to meet this Jesus. And Jesus has this great interaction with the disciples at that moment, saying, like, "I need you to open your eyes and look, because the field is ripe for the harvest." And I think he's thinking about this exact scenario. He's looking, and he can kind of see in the distance the town of Samaria is walking toward Jesus to get to know him. And it's like he's telling the disciples, these are the ones who are supposed to have it all together. He called them, they're the 12, they're supposed to be doing all the ministry. And it's like he's telling them, you went into the town and you completely missed it. Look how ready they were. That this woman of bad repute, who people probably gossiped about her and kind of knew her as the woman who's had so many husbands, her story brings an entire town to Jesus, and you came back with a couple sandwiches. Like, you just totally missed the whole point. And just her story alone was able to bring an entire town to Jesus. So there's both of those stories where it's like that woman and Levi are able to reach a whole group of people that the religious leaders and the quote-unquote insiders couldn't even fathom.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say even when it comes to connecting with a person in compassion, I think of Paul in Athens. And everybody holds that up and goes, "Wow, I could never do that. I could never do evangelism like Paul did, like walk right into the Areopagus and start preaching the gospel. Like, that's next level." Well, was it? There wasn't anything special that he did. All he did was pay attention to the cry of the people in Athens. Mm-hmm. He watched and looked and saw them offering sacrifice and building these incredible temples to gods that would never satisfy them. And he just stood up and said, "I know a God who's has the ability to satisfy you.
Yeah.
That was it. He saw their story. He shared his story. He connected them to God's story.
Yeah.
And it sounds all dramatic and all formal, but it was really pretty simple.
Yeah. It's simple, and yet how easy it is that we don't do that. I think the part that seems the simplest is he actually looked. He took the time to get to know this community.
Yeah. And I think about evangelism. We have a great neighbor. We love our neighbor, and we're just in the process.
Yeah.
Tell us about your job. Tell us about your life. Tell us about what makes you happy. Just that discovery alone, we don't think is evangelism, but it is. It is being kind without judgment and engaging somebody in honest relationship and saying, I care about you. The only thing that makes it different from just befriending someone is I do want to share how Jesus has impacted my life, and I want to give a gift out of my life to this person at some point. Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction. I want to give a gift to this person out of my life as opposed to convince them to believe something I believe. That's so important. Because church has spent a ton of its time, and maybe we can close out on this, but church spends a ton of its time gatekeeping. It's about, do you believe the right things in the right way? Do you have the right knowledge? And that orthodoxy is super important. So this isn't belittling orthodoxy, but when we make our move toward believing the right things in the right way, we start to lose sight of the fact that none of us believed right when we first stepped in with Jesus. Yeah. I made my commitment to Jesus because there were a lot of really cool people that I admired. I had no idea who Jesus was.
Yeah.
I heard some words about him, but I didn't know.
Yeah. And maybe to take this full circle, we started talking about bad statistics. And back in that book, I think this
You're going to full circle us.
Full circle, yeah.
That is beautiful.
So back, Rick Richardson writes in that book, You Found Me.
Yeah.
And looking at some of the statistics that have been done by reputable Pew Research, Barna, things like that. And yeah, this is not to say that everyone on the street is just ready to become a Christian. We might have deep disagreements, and I've had plenty of really great conversations about spirituality, and we leave and we're still on opposite sides of certain issues, but we're friends, and it was a really enjoyable. It was great for me, great for them, like that. So there are ways to even just reframe our perspective. It's not that I'm not looking for a fight. Most people don't want to fight. They actually enjoy conversations about deeper issues, about the reality of the universe, about Jesus, and one of the things when you look at it, one of the statistics that was really hopeful for me is that they interviewed a whole bunch of both Christians and non-Christians and atheists and everyone about their conversations with Christians. And the question was, so how many of those conversations turned hostile, right? Because especially for you and me, for the average Christian at church, maybe one of the things that might stop us from sharing our faith is because, well, I don't want to get yelled at. I don't want to get run out of this building, right?
I don't want them to hate me.
Yeah, I don't want them to hate me. All the awkwardness it was. I think it was a very small percentage, like 1%, maybe even less than that, honestly, of those conversations over thousands of interviews turned hostile. Right? And so even just that alone, I've had that in my mind. 99% of the conversations I engage in will not be hostile. That doesn't mean that they're going to start coming to church. They're not going to become a Christian on the spot. And as I look back on my own history of sharing my faith, I've been sharing my faith for about 20 years, from the time I was a college student till now. And I can honestly think of one instant. It was this crazy professor at UCSD who taught philosophy. And he was intense, and I brought up Jesus with him, and he turned hostile, and it was a little scary, right? Especially because he's a professor and I'm a little student. And okay, so that was one moment where I'm like, okay, that was shaky, and I did not like that. I can think back. I can't think of a single other instance where the conversation turned hostile. most of my conversations, they're very great. Like we both learn something. A lot of times we become friends, even if it might take years, and maybe it's a conversation. It's a friendship that gets developed over years and years and years. Sometimes it's one conversation on the spot, and someone says, "I was just waiting for someone to ask me, can I start reading my Bible with you?" Or there's definitely been some of those miraculous moments. But even just to think about that, and for all of our friends of the show to think about my interactions with those outside of my faith, if I just started to believe, 99% of the people I talk to, they're going to love it. They're not going to be hostile, which means...
Or worst case, happens like a friend of mine that I was sharing the gospel with, and I asked them about spiritual things, and they said to me, I don't talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they weren't offended.
Right.
I was embarrassed, but I shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
They were just setting a boundary, and I was like, okay, that's where it needed to be. That's been my worst case. I've never had anybody go philosophy professor on me, so I'm even safer than that.
Yeah. So a little bit of awkward is every once in a while. Most of the time it's going to be great, cordial. If I'm coming at it from I want to learn their story, I want to share my story, I want to find a way to point to God's story, we're going to be building a relationship the whole time. And maybe just, I'll throw a question out to you. This whole conversation feels so connected to the kind faith.
Yes.
Right? So kind faith, and I love, we have kind of like double, triple meanings on that word, but how does this all fit with the approach that kind faith has as we're trying to reach the community?
I'm glad you asked. When we picked the name Kind Faith, we had three things in mind. One was, what kind of faith do you have? What is the nature of your faith? And this comes into that. I hope we would be a people who really trust God, that He is leading us into the relationships that He's leading us in, and He's in control and loves those people more than I love those people and is engaging them. That I would have that kind of faith. And then the next part of it is, what kind of faith do you need? What is the faith that's required of us both by God, but also what kind of faith gets you through? And how do you live with the kind of faith when you get a diagnosis, or you're struggling, or you're jobless? How do you have that kind of faith? And then the last part is, it's really just to the name, be kind.
Yeah.
Be kind. And I think that, for me with evangelism, that's the thing. Can we just be kind with the people that we disagree with the people that might believe different than us? If we proceed with kindness, our faith will be put on display, and it will powerfully allow people to engage us. And they may not say, "Oh, I'm going to become a Christian after the first conversation." In fact, most of the time it's way down the road. But it is at the heart of kind faith. This, be curious, be kind, don't be judgmental. Let's engage people that way. Yeah. So our takeaways for this: be curious, not judgmental. What's another takeaway?
I think approach each conversation like you're building a relationship, which kind of goes with that, just takes it a little further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then right under that is, what's their story? What is your story? And that could just be the question.
Yeah.
And then that gives an opportunity to connect with your story and God's story in your story to bring people into that reality.
Yeah. It also makes me think, I think that mantra, be kind, is great to just think about, and we need Christians that have that going every single day. But it also makes me think of, you're going into these interactions more trusting. Like, I'm actually trusting that there is something here, and I can be kind and not be defensive or judgmental, or so that kind of trust, I think, has to get coupled with kindness.
Sounds like kind faith.
Yeah.
It is.
Faith does mean trust.
Yeah, it is. It's
yeah.
very, and I think that's probably the last takeaway.
Yeah.
People want God. They may not want the God, they may not want God, not their God. They may not want God the way you want them to want God. And they may not move toward God the way you moved toward God, or the way you think they should move toward God. But we are all built with a craving. And we need to trust that reality of how God's created the world. And everybody's got a desire. And so our job is to just bring the story, not to convince. One of the phrases that I understand why I've used it so much, but I question it again, is step over the line of faith. And it makes it sound like there's this thing, this moment I have to get people to. And when I look over the course of my life, there's been line after line after line after line. In fact, it's more of a continuum, and I'm on the line as opposed to stepping over.
I think we've kind of quoted three main passages. We looked at the Great Commission really briefly at the end of Matthew, the woman at the well in John 4, Levi's story in Mark 2, and all of those, a similar thread is like the center of all of those is Jesus. Mm-hmm. It's Jesus who says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go. And I love even that the opening of that Great Commission is the disciples are gathered around Jesus worshiping him, but it says, but some doubted. Like even in that moment of like great exaltation, the disciples are kind of like, I don't really know what I'm doing here. But it's Jesus who's the one who has all authority, who's at the center of all of this. It's Jesus who the woman takes the town, the people in the town to. Levi just hosts a party and said, Jesus, you're the guest of honor. I'm going to bring all my friends. And so when I'm in those kind of conversations with friends outside of the faith, my first question is, tell me about your story. I want to know your spirituality. What do you think about God and the universe, or however that conversation goes. But as quickly as I can, a next follow-up question is, what do you think about Jesus? So from what's your spirituality to what do you think about Jesus kind of centers the conversation. And I found that that's where it's really been able to open up, and then I can share more. And also in a non-judgmental way. I'm not saying, and you need to know the right things about Jesus, but it's...
we could keep going on this topic, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to come back to it. We're going to wrap it up today because we're at the end of our time. But, oh man, you just like triggered a whole thing in me. So stay tuned for more coming attractions. It'll be good. So let's be kind. Practice kind faith, especially with the people in your life who don't know Jesus. So God bless you. Like the video. We would love it. Comment. We would love your comments. Subscribe to the channel. That'd be super helpful. And there's all sorts of other content. Well, 2 other streams of content with the Kind Faith. There's a message every week, and then there is also Kind Faith for couples, which we think is super helpful. So grab on, lock in, be part of the movement. We would love it. God bless you. Jeff and Tyler in the morning.